Kelly won the gold medal in the wheelchair marathon in London. This is in a Starbucks in London. I ran into her and was like, oh my God, I was there with your mom and your husband, and I got to take a picture. So that was really awesome. This is me in my last Boston Marathon in 2015. It was about 37 degrees and kind of spitting snow, and our nephew, when he was young, said I look like a burrito. So next slide, Dawn. This is my husband and I up in Vail, skiing. He's a ski instructor we met in Breckenridge at Ski Spectacular. Some of you might be familiar with that event. Melissa Stockwell, CU Boulder grad, yeah? In Rio, when she won our bronze medal in paratriathlon, that's me. Again, in the Boston Marathon, people are like, oh my God, she's smiling. I'm like, no, I'm just trying to breathe. And then last year, in March, I got to ski with Hall of Fame 49er quarterback Steve Young and MC his annual fundraiser at Wasatch Adaptive in Snowbird, Utah. So sport has taken me all around the world, and it's led me to be and given me opportunities to be an advocate and also focus on sport inclusion, because sport is good for everyone. And Teddy Bruschi, longtime New England Patriot, mentioned that recently in an ESPN NFL Sunday snippet that sport is for everyone. I'm like, yes, Teddy, it is, even those with disabilities. So some of you may be familiar with this, but we're going to lay the groundwork because we don't talk about disability enough in this community. All you USA, USOPC people, come over here because I can't see you. Thank you. I know y'all hang out together. Awesome. So disability defined by the ADA, and this might be a lesson you don't need, but it's an individual whose protections apply if they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of their life activities. Examples include breathing, walking, talking, hearing, seeing. Going up the hill down here, I was breathing really hard. I have done the Boulder a number of times, so I know that last pitch into the stadium is brutal. But if any of these are impacted, you are considered to be protected by Americans with Disabilities Act. Next slide, Dawn. Thank you. Just some stats for you. The world's largest minority population is the disability population, but guess what? It's the one we talk about the least. And we have 61 million Americans that have a disability. Only 17% of those are born or have a congenital disability. Even though I was 3 years old when I got my transverse myelitis, I would be considered part of the 83% that acquire their disability later in life. It encompasses 15 to 20% of the population. Uh-oh. It's a good thing I have notes. And it includes physical disabilities, visible, invisible, which includes things like diabetes, MS, epilepsy, traumatic brain injury, and 70%, we just talked about this over lunch, are invisible disabilities. And we see numbers go up with long COVID. My husband and I have a good friend who is an adapted ski instructor up at Vail, got COVID, and is still struggling today with just taking her dog for a walk and not losing her breath. So we've had a lot of people join the disability community since COVID. And I know the panel at lunch talked a little bit about intersectionality. Disability touches every community, every race, every ethnicity, religion, ages, sexual identities. So you could have a Black queer female with cerebral palsy and be on the autism spectrum, but she's ambulatory, but she competes in a racing chair, right? So it kind of intersects with all of them. Disability is the only minority group that anyone can become a part of at any time in their life. I read articles, I meet people on a regular basis. An article I read the other day, lieutenant with a police department, also coach of high school hockey team, was on the ice, didn't have a helmet on, fell, cracked his skull, and will likely have a traumatic brain injury. Boom, in a second, life changes. Not to be the Debbie Downer, because hopefully the disability community will be here when you need us to help you figure life out post-injury or illness. Disability doesn't discriminate. Doesn't care if you have a Harvard MBA, degree, Harvard Law degree, education, doesn't care where you went, doesn't care your socioeconomic status, doesn't care what profession you're in. The example I give on a regular basis is Tiger Woods. He was in a car accident, really traumatic car accident a few years ago. Know he had discussions with his doctor on possibly amputating his leg, and what would have happened if the GOAT of golf joined this community. Everyone would be like, oh my God, Tiger Woods now has a disability, wow. Stella Young, have any of you seen Stella's TED Talk? Oh, you gotta Google it. She unfortunately passed away a few years ago. She is an Australian comedian and advocate. And she says we're more disabled by our society than by our own diagnoses. So if we say that everything's on an equal playing field, I've been at this for a long time, so I know how to navigate up and down hills and in and around communities that aren't super accessible, or transportation, or whatever it happens to be. But if everything was an equal playing field, it wouldn't matter if I had a disability or not. It's really society that sets us back because of all the barriers in society. It has nothing to do with our diagnosis. There's kind of 6 general types of barriers that may impact inclusion, specifically in this conversation in sport. So we talk about physical or architectural barriers. I'm sure we could go take a tour of Folsom Field and find a few, right? This campus is on a hill. I can tell you it's not an easy place to get around. Are all the gyms and recreation areas, Dawna will say yes, are they all accessible and that sort of thing? So, you know, we need to make sure that all of our stadiums, all our campus recreation programs, collegiate, high school, professional leagues as spectators, that people with disabilities don't have to deal with physical barriers. We know of attitudinal barriers. An example I like to share is a Paralympic friend of mine who's now retired, very smart individual, has her PhD, worked for the Biden administration. When she was, she also has transverse myelitis, she's a wheelchair user. When she was in high school, she was told that they didn't have an elevator up to the sciences floor. So they said, well, you don't need to worry about taking physics or chemistry, you're not going to college anyways. So there we go. And she's worked for the Biden administration, and she's been incredibly successful. So we need to overcome those attitudinal barriers. And when you think about collegiate sport or USOPC sport, you need to engage those donors. As they get older, they will likely have a disability, or they will have a family member, or their spouse will have a disability. And if you host things at facilities that are old and not accessible, it's going to turn people off. Institutional. So think about the history of college campuses. I know that there is a particular college gym that an adapted sport and recreation program cannot utilize because of inaccessibility. So to compensate for that, they give them access to anything and everything else they need, because they know if they needed to, they could raise the red flag on ADA violations. But they play nice, and they continue to work around the inaccessible facilities on their college campus. If we think about even physical and architectural barriers locally, when I go to Coors Field and I'm on the concourse and I have accessible seats, I can't see the board. I have to go like this to see the scoreboard. So it's just thinking about universal design and making sure everybody has the same experience in sport. Communication, signage, wayfinding. You know, being able to find my parking space right out here today, Dawna was lovely and helped me make sure that I didn't have to go up and down super steep hills today, but just trying to find the accessible parking spaces around the stadium and that sort of thing. Technological. Can I buy tickets online? Can I get access? Can I buy tickets to the Paralympic Games online? I sure hope so. But I can tell you that that's not always the case. Again, going to a Rockies game, I have to call customer service, and I have to talk to someone. I can't just go online and buy accessible seats. Are there captioning? Is there technology so that those who are hard of hearing or who have low vision can participate in the spectator experience as much as any other fan? And we think about financial barriers. We have what we call in the disability world the disability tax. On average, it's about $17,000 that people with disabilities have to pay extra in a year to support their disability. That isn't covered by medical insurance or other things. So my hand controls are usually about $1,200, and those aren't covered by anyone other than me. So it's those types of things, home modifications, different things that we have to pay for out of pocket that aren't necessarily covered in any other way. It's an extra $17,000. So if we talk about disability and ableism, anybody know about ableism? Yes. Ableism is the discrimination of people with disabilities and the social prejudice on the belief that non-disabled are superior. Let me think about comments by someone in our country in the last week, right? We got a long 4 years ahead, this disabled community of ours. At heart, people think we need fixing, and that we're just defined by our disability, which if you've worked with athletes with disabilities, which looks like many of you have, you know that's not the only thing in their world. They have families, they're getting their PhDs, they have hobbies, they have passions. Disability just happens to be a part of their life. It creates misconceptions, generalizations about disabilities, and beliefs that this entire population is less than. So an example of exclusion, I know we talked about isolation earlier at lunch, but an example of exclusion and ableism in sport, there's a cost of physical and emotional. So whatever providers, sport providers, either for athletes or for spectators, can do to make sure that we have less mental and physical hoops to jump through to participate in sport, either out here cheering on the Buffaloes, or if it's participating in wheelchair basketball, or folks were out in sleds this morning on the ice doing sled hockey, whatever you can do to make that easy and simple for them, the better. I think it's interesting that this mention up here on my slide that Brene Brown, famed social psychologist, New York Times bestseller, mentions that the pain sensors that activate when you experience physical pain are the same pain sensors that activate when someone experiences exclusion. So when we talk about DEI, like they did at lunch today, and isolation, I refer to it as the opposite of exclusion versus inclusion, but it's physical pain. So if you think about those kids that are on the sidelines, not participating in wheelchair basketball or tennis or whatever that sport happens to be, I don't think we intentionally mean for that to happen, but it does happen. And this is their emotional connection with exclusion. It's actually pain sensors setting off in your body. The financial cost of exclusion in sport and ableism in sport means a lot of money. So we have two examples here. We have the financial cost for the San Francisco 49ers, which is near and dear to my heart. I grew up in the Bay Area. My dad's high school football coach was Hall of Fame coach Bill Walsh. So I have, our blood runs deep in our family for the Niners. And we also have the Buffalo Bills. San Francisco 49ers build Levi Stadium, 30 minutes from Berkeley, home of the disability civil rights movement, and they are sued by multiple disabled fans that highlighted 1,200 ADA violations in Levi Stadium. So now the Niners organization has to pay to fix all those violations. That adds up, 1,200. And that's from everything from the parking lot, getting to the stadium. Once you get in the stadium, you got to find the restroom, you got to find concessions. From what I understand, some of their wheelchair seats are kind of angled, so you can't just roll in and sit. You have to actually lock your brakes. And some wheelchair users don't have brakes, so what do you do? They also had to pay all the plaintiffs' fees, and they had to pay all the attorneys' fees of the plaintiffs. So all told, it probably came to about $50 million. If they would have done this right, they'd have that $50 million in their pocket. And they wouldn't have a PR crisis, right? Buffalo Bills, on the other hand, they're building a new stadium. And now I don't know who to root for, because I'm like, so Buffalo Bills go to United Spinal Association, which is an advocacy group that has chapters around the country that focus on individuals with spinal cord injuries, do a lot of advocacy work, a lot of work in DC. They have a lot of work the next 4 years. But the Buffalo Bills organization went to the local United Spinal chapter and said, we're building a new stadium. Can you come out and help us plan so that all of our fans who use mobility devices have an amazing experience and have the same experience as our non-disabled fans? And that's why I'm like, who do I root for, right? Again, do you want negative PR or do you want positive PR? Do you want to be reactive and pay $50 million, or do you want to be proactive and gain support from all those disabled Buffalo Bills fans and more? And again, maybe the Niners was unintentional, don't know. But they're smart people, but they also have big wallets. And they're smart people in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, so many disabled innovators, not sure why they got into the position they got into. So being inclusive in sport is not just the good thing to do, the right thing to do, but it's also good for the bottom line. So estimates suggest that people with disabilities constitute an emerging market in the United States of almost $500 billion in annual disposable income, and a potential market of 210 million people when you include family members and caregivers. That's a lot of tickets to be sold to various sporting events here at the collegiate setting or professional sports. And then also shows that they're missing out also on $34 billion due to the lack of physical or digital access. So again, not being able to purchase those tickets online or having to jump through a bunch of hoops to buy tickets online. They'll just say, screw it, I'm not going. I'll go somewhere where I can, it's easier to manage and happen. And then also just the physical barriers. Do I want to go to Levi Stadium and be frustrated? No, I want to go and be a fan and have a great experience like everybody else, right? So again, by taking those steps to plan, be intentional, think about all your constituents in your community, either as an athlete, a participant, or as a spectator, is going to be great for your bottom line. And that's really one of the things I did in my business was the economic impact report, and we'll get to that in a second. The Sports Innovation Lab, which I was really excited to learn about their research in the last year or two about disabled sports fans, and they found that they are spending 2 times more to express their fandom through direct spending with teams than the general population. So even though many people are on a fixed income and we're paying that extra $17,000 on average in disability tax, we're still going to buy really cool stuff because we support our team. And their fandom is growing. It's growing faster over 3 years compared to the general population of 32% versus 12% of the non-disabled population. All right. Oh, yeah, we just went through that. They also noted that they have a strong purchasing power. What was it, $500 billion? Is that what I said 2 slides ago? They spend nearly $100 more per person per year in the disabled community on sport apparel and licensed brands compared to the disabled population, and they're huge baseball fans. The thinking is that they're huge baseball fans, it's a long season, and to tickets are a lot more affordable than they are to go to a game for the Broncos or the Niners or whatever it happens to be. But on average, the annual spend per person towards baseball by someone with a disability is over 200 times more than that of those without disabilities. So there's a lot of money caught up in making sure that your disabled fans feel welcome and appreciated. And again, the less hoops mentally, physically, we have to jump through to go and experience sport or participate in sport, it's going to come back to you through dollars. In 2020, as Dawna mentioned in my intro, I launched, as part of my business, All in Sport Consulting, the first of its kind adapted sport economic impact report. We've never had anything like that. It's always who participated in sled hockey, how many people participate in wheelchair basketball, how many people with this disability, age, or whatever it happened to be. So I really wanted to shift that charity narrative, because when you talk about disability sport, it's exactly where they always go. Oh, it's so cute, that cute little disabled kid. And I can say that because I was one. But I mean, it's more than that. And it's dollars and cents. And actually, there's some numbers in here from the recent Paris Paralympic Games that aren't included that I need to add, that the IPC just recently shared. But we need to move away from this charity narrative of adapted sport, and one that projects the economic power of the industry and builds a business case for adapted sport, so that when a sled hockey tournament comes to town, or a wheelchair basketball, or a sitting volleyball tournament, or some other sport comes to town, they're staying in hotels, they're going to restaurants, they're going to attractions, they're bringing their family. So again, all that adds up in the sport tourism world. In last year's report, which reflects, so it was done in 2024, but it reflects data in 2023, is projected to be nearly $144 million in just adapted sport. So that's not fans going to professional teams or games or stuff like that. That is the, when you go to a ski race, when you go to an adapted sport event in town, it's $144 million in economic impact. And one of my sport tourism friends noted, adapted sport organizations have been instrumental in helping us capture a more accurate picture of the industry's economic significance, providing communities with compelling business reasons to host events, and building robust support for competing athletes. So again, if your community is accessible, the more likely you're going to get more of these adapted sports to your community, which is going to drive up your economic impact of visiting athletes. So some best practices to think about when you look at inclusion of disability sport in your community, in your programs, in your rec center here, in hosting the Colorado Buffaloes. I know they just announced their schedule for football yesterday, but to ensure that your organization or you have committees related to this, and it's focused on nothing about us without us. This is a statement that the disability community lives by. And it means you can do whatever you want, Levi Stadium, but you didn't include us, and now you're paying the price. So make sure you have volunteers with disabilities on your committees, employees, leadership, boards, committees. Bring in a variety of spectators. Bring in someone who is blind. Bring in someone who has a traumatic brain injury. Bring in someone who uses a mobility device. Bring in someone who is hard of hearing, and have a diverse community of people to walk through your stadium with you, walk through your rec center with you, and make sure that it's easy and simple for them to park, to get into your building, to use your locker rooms, to get to your concession stands, your restrooms, and make sure that they can have a good, positive experience. Some good examples of universal design. So when you're looking at designing a building possibly or doing renovations, use your universal design principles. You can Google it. There's 7 elements related to universal design. But ultimately, and from a baseline perspective, it means that everybody who participates in whatever that activity is has the same experience. And a good examples of this is the Olympic and Paralympic Museum. So you go up the elevator, and everybody experiences the museum in the same way. It's not like mom and dad use the elevator, the kid in the chair uses the ramp, the whole family uses the museum and goes through the museum in the same way. The example of the Buffalo Bills Stadium and the Mary Free Bed YMCA is the only universally designed YMCA in the country in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Another way to practice nothing about us without us is to implement what we did for the World Games in 2022 in Birmingham, was to follow 3 principles and put work plans together of how you're going to take care of your athletes and make sure everything is accessible from them, from when they land in your community, if they're flying in or driving in, make sure their equipment, their sport equipment is taken care of, make sure that their everyday equipment is taken care of, that they have a great welcoming experience at the airport. And so we want to make sure that the athlete experience is positive, the spectator experience is positive, make sure all your venues are accessible. Do what we call know before you go guides that say this is where Uber rideshare will drop you off at the stadium. This is where the shuttle will drop you off so that you know where you're getting dropped off and where your section is if you're watching a game. And then also volunteer training, which could include staff and could also include media and press. We want to make sure the media and press are using appropriate, respectful words related to disability. And we also want to make sure that if there is a press conference, and if it's elevated, that there's a stage for athletes that may be using a mobility device. Otherwise, it's not the same experience. I can tell you, here's an example. So we know we don't like the word confined or bound to a wheelchair. And I did an interview with a local radio and TV station here in town in Denver. I go. We were supposed to meet in the tech center, which is very accessible, lots of parking. They wanted me to come downtown, which doesn't have great accessible parking. So they said, park in our garage. I go upstairs, use the restroom. They're like, oh, we don't have an accessible restroom on our floor. You have to go up to the 4th floor. And even that restroom wasn't super accessible. But I was like, okay, you're inviting a bunch of people here who have disabilities to be interviewed, and you don't have an accessible restroom on your floor. So maybe we look for another spot to do this interview. And then when they did my introduction, they said, oh, well, Dawna Callahan confined to a wheelchair. And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe they just said that. And it threw me off. And I could just feel that shock of a media group using those words. And it just shows how much influence media has. If they had gotten it right, I would have been so much better about my interview, but I went into my interview just so flustered that the media had referred to me as confined to my wheelchair, even though they were highlighting me as a wheelchair racer. So I'm not confined to my chair, am I? Because I get in and out of my chair into my racing chair. And I'll just leave you guys with this great quote from Andrew Parsons, president of the International Paralympic Committee. Sport has proven a tremendous driver for changing attitudes, advancing legislation, empowering people, and changing the societal fabric. And when we look at disability sport, either as a spectator or as a participant or an athlete, you know, sport it starts everything. And I put in here, simply sport changes everything. And it's an entry point. It's kind of like a gateway drug, I guess you could say. It's an entry point into how do we change transportation. A lot of the new rulings with the Department of Transportation with airlines was because of athletes with disabilities getting frustrated that their equipment or their everyday equipment or their everyday mobility device did not show up at the end of a flight. They couldn't compete, they couldn't get around. So we have an opportunity to have impact in legislation, transportation, in our communities, and changing attitudes, changing the media. Got a long ways to go on that one. And just changing the way people think about disability, that it's not negative, it's a normal part of life. And hopefully by building this business case, they see that it's not just the inspirational stories and the feel-good stories, but there's actually an economic component to it, and they start to see that. So, any questions? I know we're a little early. Any questions from anyone? I hope you use this data. You can go to my website. The $144 million is there. So, there we go. Yeah, it's on my website. Yeah, Sean.
Separate adaptive sports events for like separately, specifically for people with disabilities. Yeah. I would love to do both. You know, budgets are tight. Where do you fall on, do you have an opinion on, is it better to focus on a para-specific event or to include athletes with disabilities in your quote unquote mainstream events?
Is this my personal opinion? Or
yeah.
I like events that are integrated because the para side, the adapted side, gets so much more exposure versus the 20 people that show up at the gym to cheer on their spouses or whatever it happens to be. You get the whole group of people that are participating in the non-disabled piece and the disabled piece. So I like the integrated event because not that our job is to educate people all the time, but it's helpful. That's 300 more people that will have exposure to wheelchair lacrosse, whereas, you know, everybody who comes to the wheelchair standalone event, wheelchair lacrosse event, are all the people that already know about it, right? Sure. So I like the integrated thing, and there's a really interesting picture, and it's on my phone, that a longtime friend of mine who is a Paralympian, she was a skier many years ago, but it has the non-disabled World Championship course. Have you guys seen this? Recently? Yeah, in the last week. And then it has the para-alpine ski course, which is really pathetic. Like, this one is beautiful and pristine. It has a lodge at the bottom, and this one has brown grass and what I call in early season skiing, the white ribbon of death. And it's just this one strip, and they actually canceled some events yesterday because it wasn't safe, and the athletes called them out on it. So I just think the more you can have integrated, if it works, I mean, from a time perspective, a staff lift perspective, resource perspective, I like the idea of the integrated thing because it just brings so much exposure to a sport they maybe never even knew. And then they'll be like, oh yeah, I have a second cousin whose daughter had, it happens every day, who had a spinal cord injury, and oh, she could play wheelchair. I didn't know that, right? So it could grow the sport.
You're right.
It could grow the sport.
We had a wheelchair, kind of like we did out here. Like we had sport chairs for people just to hop in, and it was like there was a group of people just curious about it because they hadn't seen it before.
Exactly. Right. And then if they have a colleague or a family member or a neighbor, they'll be like, hey, I saw this. Would you want to try it? And honestly, and unfortunately, that's how a lot of people learn about adapted sport in our country, is by happenstance. They're walking by a gym and they see something and they go tell a neighbor, they tell a friend. So there isn't anything necessarily structured in our country for identification of athletes on the para side. So I say anytime you can spread the word and educate and share the experience with more than our little bubble, right? And that's really part of my business too, is it's one thing to share information with groups that know this. That's why I wish so many other people were here, because they need to hear it. You guys probably already know this, but it's to speak to those people who don't know this, and to speak to them as, we're not in a tunnel, we're not in an echo chamber. Those that know the adapted sport world, know the adapted sport world. Let's go beyond. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What are some strategies when you do host combined events like that to draw the line between visibility and not making the parasport seem like a showcase? It's something we struggle a lot with the NCAA championship. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, we've got the same thing where we get invited. Lacrosse is unique because
Right, and it's
you can't do that.
it's an exhibition.
It's like, hey, do you want to play in the parking lot?
No. I think more athletes need to participate, and I think there needs to be more events. I mean, 100 meters in a racing chair takes a nanosecond, right? So I think there needs to be field events and track events and longer track events and even non-racing chair events, so that people can see amputees running and those with cerebral palsy and those classifications. I hear you, and I really wish the exhibitions would stop and people would see it. I think a couple good models is the Commonwealth Games. A former colleague of mine, he worked at Disabled Sports USA before the name changed many years ago, went on to work at the IPC, and he's the only American to be CEO of the Commonwealth Games Federation. And he, because of his experience at the IPC and with Paralympics, is so deep to him that he was like, these aren't exhibition. We're bringing them in because these are medal events. And I know they get medals, but I think there's a deeper issue in that. And I talked to Ash in the last presentation about we need to get more disabled athletes involved in NCAA sports, because there aren't. I mean, you have U of I, Arizona, now Michigan, Alabama. So I think I hear you, but I think it's a systemic issue in NCAA. And then I think once they embrace it and respect it for being sport, and that it's not club sport, then I think it'll bring that respect that it deserves, right? Yeah. And more athletes competing. It can't be 100 meters and I don't know what all of them are, but they need to be included in. Yeah. I don't know if that helps you. It's more of my rant. It's more of my rant and soapbox. I have a lot of them. Ask Sean, he knows. Yeah, but I think it's more of a system issue in university recognition of disabled athletes. Yeah. Anything else? I know Dewan's going to boot me in a sec. I don't know where he went. Oh, there you are. Yeah. Any other questions?
When you had that interview and they used language that kind of threw you off, did you use that opportunity to educate them?
Unfortunately, my main contact was out of the country at the time. So I never got a chance to go back. I think she had a death in the family. So I didn't feel like it was, you're down and out already, and now I'm going to hammer on you again. But there will be an opportunity for me to go back. I have no doubt that I will be able to go back. If she hadn't been out of the country and out of the office, I would have been like, come on, we need to work on this. And, slowly, hopefully, NBC covering the Paralympic Games in Paris, I hope they would step it up and get to a Channel 4 in the UK. level. Again, another rant, soapbox. What was that? Oh, yeah, yeah, yep. And I'm friends with Lacey, who is the on-site commentator, athlete commentator with NBC, and I know it was challenging for her. So we need to, the more the media reflects us in a not pathetic position or inspirational position, the better. Yeah. Yeah. Do I still have time, Dwan? You had a question? Yeah.
Somebody who runs a social media page and does like to talk about parasports and adaptive sports, what is something that you would suggest that I should do what is the most important thing I should educate people on through my platform in your honest?
Well, who is on your platform? Is it people like the echo chamber? Is it people that already know this stuff?
It is people
Okay.
who, throughout the Paralympic Games, I did have a lot of people that came through and they did want to learn about it.
Yep.
But I didn't know exactly what I should be educating everybody on. Most people are completely oblivious.
Yeah.
They just see it and they hear the way that I talk about it and they're just like, I want to know more about it.
Yeah.
I want to.
And it sounds like,
them in a way
yeah.
that like makes sense to where I'm not disrespecting anybody, but I'm not like leaving anything out.
well, I think the focus needs to be on sport.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah. So if you're doing that, I think you're doing the right thing in that I think sometimes media wants to focus on the story and the tragedy and how they've gotten to where they've come from. And it's like, but when we talk about Olympics, we don't always, there's a few, I'll say there's a few stories out there that are like that, but it's about how powerful they are, how fast they are, how strong they are. And I think that if you're doing that, I think that's a good position to take.
Because something I try and do is push it as these are athletes who just so happen to be disabled.
Have a disability, yeah,
So,
yeah. There's a, and I don't know what it is. If you email me, I can find it for you. But it's a race in Rio, and it was a blind runner running against an Olympian, and I think the blind runner won the race. There you go. Right?
athletes are athletes.
Yeah, exactly. Athletes are athletes, and that's how they should be looked at and written about and posted about. They just so happen to have a disability, but it's not the worst thing that's happened to them, right? But I think if you continue to focus on their athleticism, I think that's what we really need to drive home with the media versus the, oh, look at how far they've come. And we can know that for ourselves, but that's our own decision to make. That's not the media's decision to make, right? So good job for positioning the athletes as athletes. Thank you.
Can we give Dawna a round of applause?